second French president, Emmanuel Macron's party was trounced by candidates for Marine Le Pen's Nationalist Party.
So here's how the vote actually broke down. A stunning rebuke of Macron's centrist coalition, a big victory for the political right.
This is suicide. This is suicide.
Some people are definitely losing their minds in Europe now that the European Parliament elections have happened, and there has clearly been a rightward shift in the politics of the European Union. Now, that follows, again, the outcome of the EU's election, which is different from the individual countries that make up the EU and the elections that they have. However, the European Union's election basically had an impact, a huge impact on France and the possible political makeup of that country. Now, before we get to France and an incredibly risky move that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, made, let's understand what happened during the EU Parliament elections. Now, in order to understand it, we need to kind of get familiar with the main political parties at play. So in the European Parliament elections, individual countries' parties fit within one of 9 different overarching groups, 2 of which are definitively associated with the right, the Identity and Democracy and the European conservatives and reformists. Now, Europeans did vote in more, they did vote in more right-wing politicians, make no mistake about it. And they did so in many countries that make up the European Union. That includes Germany, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy. Okay, so if you're concerned about, the basically reemergence of the right wing in Europe, well, you have cause for concern, especially after we saw the results of the parliament elections. So with the results now in for all 27 member states, the 2 right-wing parties combined hold 131 of the 720 seats, which is an increase of 15 seats from the last election. And other unaffiliated parties, including the far-right FIDs, who hold about 100 additional seats, right? So what's important to keep in mind is, look, there are major political issues that explain this rightward shift in political preferences, but it's also important to keep in mind that for now, the centrists, the various centrist parties have formed a coalition to ensure that there's still the majority within the EU Parliament. So centrists still kind of rule the day, but clearly what we're seeing is this move toward more and more right-wing politicians within the European Union. And there are some major reasons for why that's happening. Part of the rightward shift is driven by centrist politicians moving further to the right on immigration in particular, operating under the premise that immigration is a major concern for voters and that promising harsher policies would help the center retain power. And look, this is different from the weak, pathetic Democrats in the United States who try to run as like Republican light and typically lose elections. I don't want you guys to compare what's happening to the European Parliament to the Democrats in the United States, because it is in fact true that there is a lot of backlash among European voters in regard to the influx of migration into some of these European countries, not all, but certainly some of them. And so the immigration problem isn't the only issue that's moving the European Union to a right-wing agenda. Besides immigration, the right wing was especially able to capitalize on environmental policies because of large-scale protests by European farmers, especially in France and Germany, about the economic effects of the bloc's climate change policies.
Pausing here to deliver some honest truth as we do in our news coverage as well. TYT is facing challenges, guys, as the entire industry is. You know who could make the difference? You. If you hit the join button below, it's gonna make all the difference and keep us in business. We appreciate you, thank you.
So I'm gonna pause and riff a little bit on this point because this is what I've been trying to warn about in the context of the United States. And Waz and I actually had a wonderful conversation about it not too long ago, where a Washington Post reporter was encouraging Americans to stop using hot water in any context, whether you're washing your clothes, washing your dishes, or washing yourself. She tried to get people to take cold showers to save the environment. And the more you put the onus on ordinary people, the more you put the economic burden in combating climate change on ordinary people, the more backlash you're gonna get to it or in response to it. And you're certainly starting to see that in Europe. And so I thought it was important to highlight that point. Now, inflation also continues to be a huge problem in Europe as well. And in Austria, it's particularly pronounced. And so the sanctions that have been implemented on Russian fuel has taken a toll on energy prices there. And if you have high energy prices, that's gonna translate to higher prices for goods and services as well, because goods are gonna certainly be far more expensive, because transporting those goods is going to be more expensive due to the higher costs of fuel. So these elections weren't just about embracing right-wing voters or embracing the fact that these right-wing voters wanted to push back on centrist and left-leaning policies. They just feel like the center and the left hasn't really been working for them or looking out for their best interests. And we've only kind of heard one side of the European story as it pertains to the ongoing war in Europe, in Ukraine, I should say. You would think that everyone in Europe is super concerned because, they might be next. Putin might come after them next. And, countries like Poland, I think, certainly do feel that way. But there's also an economic toll that the war in Ukraine is having on Europeans. And so there's a growing body of, voters who are kind of starting to side with the right wing, who want to put an end to this war in Ukraine and basically force Ukraine to make a deal with Putin. However you feel about that's your decision to make, that's your feeling to have, but I'm just explaining what some Europeans are feeling as a result of the economic toll that this war in Ukraine is having on them. Now, the centrists did take a hit as a result of this backlash from the policies. So for instance, the centrist Renew group, the centrist Europe Renew group, the party of French President Emmanuel Macron, lost a stunning 23 seats, while the more left-wing Greens/European Free Alliance lost 19. So look, this again does not mean that there's this massive change in the makeup of the EU, because ultimately Macron's coalition is combined with other centrist parties across Europe, and they still have a significant amount of power and sway within the European Parliament. But it is true the centrists are losing ground. The left is losing ground, and they're not losing ground to the far left. They're losing ground to the right wing. The center-left Socialists and Democrats, which lost 4 seats, and the center-right European People's Party still have the largest number of seats, combined with Renew, the center, which still holds the majority of seats. But Macron clearly took a hit. His specific party took a hit. And that is the reason why he has decided to take a massive risk. And I can't believe he decided to do this, but he might be taking a risk in order to play a long game. So let me explain. Because of the outcome of the EU Parliament election, Macron decided to basically take this gamble in France by calling for emergency elections. Okay, so French President Macron called a snap parliamentary election in his country because his party did so poorly, and the notorious far-right German party, AfD, won more seats than German Chancellor Olaf Scholz Social Democrats did. Even if Macron loses, by the way, he's still going to remain president. So this is not going to be a snap presidential election. He has a mandate to serve as president till 2027. So you should think of this as a legislative election. Here's more.
In France, the snap election call is just a legislative election call. It's not a presidential election. So if Marine Le Pen's party were to win a majority, Emmanuel Macron would stay president. But he'd have to appoint a prime minister, typically from the party that wins the most seats. And that would mean sharing power, where the president keeps control of foreign policy and defense, while the prime minister takes charge of domestic affairs and budgets.
An arrangement like this would make France, I would say, almost ungovernable. Macron is a staunch believer in the EU. The far right wants to completely dismantle the bloc from the inside. And they have completely different views on immigration, Ukraine, the environment.
So if Marine Le Pen's party wins during the snap election, and Macron has no choice but to have this prime minister, far-right prime minister, obviously it's going to cause tension within the French government. It's going to be essentially the type of gridlock we experience in Congress. So why the hell would Macron want to do this? Well, there's what he says publicly, which you should always take with a grain of salt, right? Anytime a politician says they're doing something for a specific reason, they're not giving you the full story. I'm gonna give you what I think the full story is in just a moment. But the French leader said his move to call early polls, the voting will take place in 2 rounds on June 30th and July 7th, showed his confidence in the French people. He urged moderate politicians from the left and the right to regroup with his own centrist alliance in order to defeat the far right. And there have been some protests taking place in France. There are some predictions or some speculation that Macron is of the mind that now that it's real, that there could be a right-wing shift in France. Maybe this is gonna motivate or galvanize the more moderate or left-wing voters in the country to solidify power behind the centrists or the left wing. But Macron justified his decision by the fact that he could not ignore the new political reality after his pro-European party was handed a chastening defeat and garnered less than half the support of the National Rally with its star leader, Jordan Bardella. But look, it's interesting because some analysts are arguing that no, Macron's actually playing a long game here. And I like this prediction. I like this speculation because I think it makes a lot of sense. I still think it's incredibly risky for Macron to do this. But they're arguing that, look, there are some pretty deep issues right now in France. There is a huge budget deficit that's difficult to deal with. And whoever is in charge of domestic policy in France is gonna have to make some real tough decisions. Decisions that I would venture to say Macron does not wanna make. So if the far right-wing party wins legislatively and they have say over the domestic policy in France, well then they're gonna either have to cut spending, which, well, we know what people in France feel about that. We've seen the mass protests that have basically come up after there have been, there was this effort to increase the retirement age in France, nothing like what we have here in the United States. People in France have fought a lot more aggressively in order to protect their right to retire at a more acceptable younger age, right? But nonetheless, there was a proposal to increase the retirement age and people took to the streets like you wouldn't believe. I remember covering that story. And so if the right-wing party wins and they start proposing cuts to social services, if they start demanding hiring taxes or start demanding that they hire taxes, that could be incredibly unpopular. And by the time the next presidential election comes around in 2027, well, then there might be increased distaste toward the right wing in France. And that could actually pave the way for the centrists to win easier victories. So that is a risk because it's just assuming that the right wing will be unpopular by the time 2027 rolls around. So others argue it would have been far better for Macron to take what happened in the European Parliament as something to inform his decisions moving forward so he can actually work on, increasing his favorability and the centrist favorability among the French electorate. That's a lot harder to do, right? That would mean that he'd have to get his hands dirty and he would have to work for the French people in order to garner support for them. But it seems like he'd rather kind of go along with this stunt. And I really do think that what the analysts are predicting here is true. I really do think that's what's motivating his decision. So we'll see how it plays out. But it is not necessarily good news that the perception of European voters is that, the centrists and the left in Europe haven't really done much to represent their best interests. And they're frustrated about their economic conditions. They're frustrated about their own version of the migrant crisis. And so they're looking to kind of retaliate against the current power structure, against the current power holders within the European Union because they want change. And so we'll see how that all plays out. But there you have it. There's a good summary of what happened in the European Union and what is currently happening in France. We'll give you an update after those legislative elections take place in France.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.